I call the honourable member Russell Norman.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I rise to speak on this urgent debate about the government being forced to delay the sale of Mighty River Power and about the whole government asset sale program. We just had a speech from the Minister of Finance where right towards the end of the speech he got towards some of the rationale for why the government's pursuing this. But I think what's been marked in this whole debate is that the government has failed to make a coherent argument as to why they're going down this path. And I want to go over some of the arguments they've put forward. They've kind of randomly put forward a series of arguments over time to try to explain why they're doing what they're doing. The first argument was the fiscal argument. The government said, well, we've given away these tax cuts to upper income earners, we've created a budget deficit and somehow we have to try to fill the deficit, and that's why we want to sell these assets. Well, the problem with this argument is that aside from the sheer immorality of giving large tax cuts to wealthy New Zealanders and making poor and middle New Zealand pay for it, aside from the immorality of that argument, in fact, the government's asset sale program makes the government's deficit worse. According to Treasury and Budget Policy Statement 2011 and 2012, the asset sale program, if it goes ahead, would make the government's deficit worse by about $100 million a year. And the reason for that is very simple. The assets make good returns, and so the cost of interest for the government is actually much less than the returns on the assets. So if you're just taking a pure fiscal approach, actually you'd hang on to the assets because they make very good returns to the government, and the government would be in a much better fiscal position to hold on to the assets. The second argument the government put forward was that these companies need access to capital, and that's why they need to be privatised. Now, of course, these companies already have access to capital in the form of borrowing, so the only new way they would have access to capital is being able to issue more equity or more shares. The only problem with that argument is that if the government sells down 49%, then if the government is to maintain 51%, it's to maintain its 51% ownership of these companies, then all of the new shares issued by these companies, the government would have to buy half of them in order to maintain its position. It's very unlikely that this government, or perhaps future governments, would be willing to purchase half of all the new shares offered by these companies, and hence the access to capital argument is not a very good argument because it doesn't really help these companies get access to capital. The third argument the government has put forward is the argument around debt. This is a very strange argument, and it's very strange because the government can currently borrow at 3.5%. That's what it's currently borrowing at, whereas these assets return somewhere between 8 and 18%, depending on which numbers you look at, on the capital. So, in fact, what the government's doing is selling assets that make very high rates of return in order to avoid debt, which is very cheap. So from a purely economic or fiscal point of view, it is completely irrational to sell these arguments in order to avoid debt that will cost you 3.5% when these assets are earning you 8 to 18%. So that's the third argument, which doesn't make any sense and is kind of irrational. The fourth argument is the market argument. They say we have to do this privatisation in order somehow to facilitate the electricity market in New Zealand. The problem for that argument is that the electricity market is an oligopoly. There's a small number of players that will remain so, whether it's privatised or not privatised, so that fundamentally doesn't change anything. And in terms of making the market more efficient, the government has taken one step in this regard, which is to move generating assets around. They moved generating assets from Meridian to Genesis in order to try to make sure there's more competition in the market. Now, that was only possible because the companies were SOEs. So if the government were to privatise the companies and they were no longer SOEs, the government would not have the ability to shift generating assets around in the way they just have, purely, they say, in order to improve the functioning of the electricity market. So the one tool that they currently have, because these companies are SOEs, they would no longer have. So the fourth argument around market efficiency doesn't make any sense. The fifth argument the government put forward is related to that, which is around prices. They argue that private companies have lower electricity prices than the publicly owned companies. In fact, the truth is the opposite. It's about 12% more expensive, the electricity from the privately owned companies, than it is from the publicly owned ones. At first, the government denied this research when the Green Party and Grey Power released it, but then the government themselves were forced to acknowledge that Treasury had actually presented a paper paper to the government which had demonstrated that the claims made by Grey Power and the Greens that the public companies were in fact 12% cheaper than the private companies was true. So the fifth argument around prices doesn't hold water either, because in that case as well, in fact, the public companies have cheaper electricity than the private ones. So that's the fifth argument which we've managed to see the government put forward. The sixth argument the government put forward was around capital markets. They said it would deepen and improve New Zealand's capital markets. The problem for this argument is that, in fact, a lot of the shares will be sold overseas, and increasingly so in future. In fact, the government, it seems, one of the proposals on the table is to actually list these companies on the Australian Stock Exchange in order to attract Australian investors into the companies. And what we've seen with the Contact Energy float was that more and more of the ownership goes into overseas ownership. Moreover, from the point of view of most investors, small-scale retail investors in New Zealand, what they're looking for is a safe company to invest in, safe returns, because they've been burnt by the finance companies, and so they're looking for a safe return, something they can invest in, and in fact, issuing bonds, as these companies currently can, issuing bonds is actually a much safer instrument for most small-scale retail investors in New Zealand. When they're looking for somewhere to invest their money, they'd much prefer to buy a bond issued by an SOE than they would to buy shares in companies on the share market. So in terms of New Zealand's capital markets, and in terms of looking at it from the perspective of small-scale retail investors in New Zealand, it doesn't make any sense to do what they're doing. The seventh argument the government has mounted is around the question of mandate. Well, they've said, well, if there's no kind of rational reason why you'd want to privatise these assets, if you can't make an economic case for it, well, we have a mandate. We won the election, they say, and therefore we can do it. In fact, when you look at the votes cast at the last election, the majority of votes cast were cast for parties that oppose privatisation. Even if you include United Future and ACT and National together in the camp that supported privatisation, they got a minority of the votes at the election. A majority of votes at the election were cast for the parties that opposed privatisation, not just the parties represented in this parliament, but also parties outside of this parliament who didn't get seats in this parliament because they didn't make the threshold. So that's the mandate argument, which is the seventh argument that the government's put up. They say we've got a mandate. In fact, they don't have a mandate. When you look at the actual votes cast, most New Zealanders voted for parties that opposed the privatisation plan. Moreover, of course, when you look at the opinion polls, probably about 7 out of 10 New Zealanders are opposed to the government's privatisation plan. So there's no support from most New Zealanders. And then perhaps the eighth argument, which we heard a bit from Bill English just before, is that it enables more New Zealanders somehow to participate in all of this, is the kind of vague language that he was using. One can only assume that he means more New Zealanders can buy these shares than currently own them. Now, of course, 100% of New Zealanders currently own these companies. So if we look at who will be able to afford to buy shares in these companies, it's a very small minority of people who will be able to afford to buy shares in these companies. Most New Zealanders will in fact lose their ownership of these companies through the privatisation process, because all New Zealanders currently own these companies, and what the government wants to do is hand it over to a very small number. So whichever way you look at it, whether you look at the fiscal position, where it doesn't make any sense to sell them, whether you look at the access to capital argument, where it doesn't make any sense to privatise them to allow them to access capital, the debt position, of course the government's borrowing much cheaper than the rate of return on the company, so it doesn't make any sense to sell them to avoid debt. If you look at the market argument, in fact it won't help the efficiency of the electricity market. If you look at the prices argument, in fact the private electricity companies are more expensive. Whether you look at the New Zealand capital argument, where this will add nothing to the ability of New Zealanders to actually invest in this sector, whether you look at the mandate argument, where a majority of people voted for parties against it, or whether you look at this vague idea of New Zealanders wanting to participate, in fact most New Zealanders won't be able to participate because they won't be able to afford it. Every one of the arguments, so-called arguments, that the government's put up has been shot down. So they have no arguments left, and all they have left is ideology. They simply believe in privatisation, because when you look at the arguments, they don't hold water. So what's left? Well, we hear it from the ACT Party, which is the real who understands what's really behind this whole thing. It is an ideology of privatisation. even if none of the arguments hold or none of the arguments stand up to close scrutiny. In fact, there was always an alternative for these companies. They should be part of New Zealand's green energy future. These companies should be exporting green technology and renewable energy technology to the world. Some of them are already starting to do it. They have the critical mass in terms of skills, experience, capital, in fact, to do that. And that is the alternative future for these companies, Mr. Speaker. Rather than privatise them, keep them in New Zealand, headquartered here, R&D here. That is a much more prosperous future for our country.
I call the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Mr. Speaker, the National